In this video, I'll show you how I draw skin tones on portraits using colored pencils. I'm going to draw some darker skin tones as well as some very fair skin tones to show you the differences in technique. This footage is from a class recording from our paid virtual classes where we learn about portraiture for a few weeks as a group. We all chose different people to draw, so we first did these small studies on coloring realistic skin. I chose Morgan Freeman as my first subject because he has a great face. He has rich skin tones, great textures in his hair, and asymmetrical features that make his face super memorable. Usually, I start most portraits with a light sketch of the face, focusing primarily on shapes and getting the facial proportions right. Here, I'm sketching out the lines of his eyes, nose, and mouth first, and if the likeness looks even a little bit off at this stage, I can adjust it before moving on to the details. Next, I'll check the distances between the elements of his face, like the width of his nose is the same distance as the space between his ear and nose. For me, it's really the shapes and the alignments between them that make all the difference for mapping out accurate facial proportions. For a better likeness, I check my alignments and proportions. The inner corners of the eye often align with the outer corner of the nose, but in this case his iris was where the alignment was. I find a lot of beginners may fuss over their lines too much, but at this stage I'd focus on the shapes and not go too heavy on the outlines because it usually interferes with the coloring. So I'm only going to color a little bit of the skin to give you an idea of how it could work. I think I want to color in the left side of the image because it has a full range of values and really good contrast with dark shadows and highlights. When I draw skin, I think of an overall base shadow color, a base highlight color, and a base midtone color. Then I add thin layers of other colors on top of the base colors and blend them. In this case, it can be 3 types of browns. You'll probably be relieved that you don't actually need too many colors for this. I'm using a set of 48 colors, but you could probably even get away with less. The trick is all about layering and blending techniques. I'm using a mixed media paper with a little bit of tooth, but overall pretty smooth. And if your paper is too smooth, like marker paper, it doesn't blend well because there's not enough tooth to hold the pigment. And if the paper has too much tooth, you get these white speckles, which can be annoying to get rid of. But in this case, the little speckles kind of look like skin, so it worked out. Always try to know where your light source is coming from, and use that as a guide to shading forms on the face. Usually speaking, the shadows and skin are cooler and the highlights are warmer. However, in this case, and often the case with darker skin, it's the opposite. The shadows here are warmer and the highlights are cooler. There are actually 2 light sources, one warmer light hitting the front of his face and some cool bounce light coming from the left. I recommend blocking in the darkest values first so you have a better sense of your values overall. After the darks are blocked in, the transitions or midtones between the darks and the lights are usually more red in hue. This is because of subsurface scattering, the technical term for when light interacts with translucent skin and looks very luminous. If you're curious, I'll link a video dedicated to subsurface scattering that you can check out next. From the midtones, I move on to the lighter areas in the highlights and work my way up to the lighter values. Eyes also have some of those darker values and they have the most contrast on the face, which is why eyes always attract our attention first. I'm just blocking in the eyebrows and some of the texture in the hair, but just a little bit, and leaving the rest for a deliberately unfinished look. Okay, also adding in some of his freckles because I couldn't wait until the end. For the bounce light, I'm going to add a light blue-violet or periwinkle hue to give it more visual interest and separate it from the warm light source. This is a way of artificially adding more color to the portrait. If the background was a vibrant color, you will definitely see that background color in the bounce light as well. So here my background is white, but if I wanted a bright colored background, I definitely want to put in some of the background color into the skin tones. So when I'm drawing the eyes, I always make sure I'm using a sharp pencil to keep my lines crisp. I also tend to sneak in reds around the corners of the eyes to give them more of a realistic look. The other common mistake that beginners make a lot is leaving the whites of the eyes too white, like paper white. If you look closely, you'll notice that the whites of the eyes are not pure white, and because eyeballs are spherical, only a small part of the sphere will be white, usually that wet highlight, but most of it is in shadow. When I draw lips, I'll usually choose a pinkish base color and then start to slowly add skin tones back into it during the blending phase. Overall, darker skin can appear more colorful because there are more mid-tone hues than light hues. Become a Wing Canvas member on YouTube or Patreon for access to our private art community with cool perks like classes and critiques. Our free video tutorials are made possible by our generous members and students who sign up for paid programs at our school. So with your support, we can continue making art education easily accessible to everyone. In the next skin tone exercise, I chose Christina Hendricks as my subject. Apart from being absolutely stunning with bright red lips and hair, she has super fair skin, which can be very tricky to draw because the values are all very light and subtle, even the shadows on her face. As I'm sketching, I'm looking for the same things as before: alignments, shapes, and overall proportions by measuring and comparing the distances between her facial features. Her hair also has a ton of volume on top of her head, so I want to make sure I capture those shapes and even exaggerate them a bit. Her bangs can also be simplified into shapes. By the way, we have a ton of hair tutorials on our channel, so if you're looking for different tips on hairstyles and types of hair, you can check that out next. You'll notice that I drew an upside down triangle under her nose. This is really to indicate the shadow shape or the bottom plane of the nose. I also lightly sketched out all the shadow shapes on the rest of her face, like underneath her chin. In this drawing, I'm going to color in her mouth first. Where I start first changes with each unique drawing. Because she's wearing bright red lipstick, I feel like it's easier to start at her mouth to build up more context for the rest of the portrait. I start by drawing the opening and the corners of her mouth because they're the darkest, and then I add the red. Next, I'm going to use a brown color and a purple color to darken the areas of the mouth and blend them because I don't have the exact shade of red. Whenever I don't have an exact color, I need to mix them. Next, I'll draw in some of her red hair, starting with her bangs. When drawing hair, it's important that your strokes match the direction of hair growth, or it can get really weird. Because I don't have the exact colors I see in the photo, I'm using blends of oranges, reds, and browns, and ochres in layers. Now I'm taking out the colors I see in her skin tones, mostly light beige, pinks, and peaches. I also took out some grays and even some greens because I can see some cool greens in the shadows of her face, most likely from bounce light reflecting off her blouse. I started with a layer of the peach tone and then lightly added in the rosy cheeks and subtle grays in the shadows. Oops! I noticed at this point I drew the eye too low, so I'm going to move the hair down and redraw the eye up higher before I continue. Glad I drew this lightly enough to erase. So again, avoid pressing too hard in your initial sketch in case you need to move something when there's already some color on your drawing. Okay, her eyes are very dark, especially with her jet black eyeliner, which creates even more contrast. I'm adding some green to her iris and then some grays on the whites of her eyes to give it some depth. Next, I'm going to add some of the shadows along her nose and draw in her nostrils. Nostrils are one of those things many people struggle with, and the best tip I have for you is to draw them with reds instead of black. Nostrils are generally very dark, but they tend to glow reddish and because they have a lot of blood vessels inside, and when our skin is translucent, again, this is called subsurface scattering. If you make the nostrils too cool, it starts to look very weird and almost unhuman-like. So it can be a bit scary to add dark, shadowy colors to fair skin, so I just do it in soft layers and keep blending. I use these two grays, and you can see one is cooler, one is slightly warmer, but they are both a lot darker than her skin tone. So I had to press very lightly to keep my values light. It takes a lot of control to figure out the best pencil pressure to achieve the look that you want. Now, I'm going to be a bit bolder here with my colors and add this teal hue to some of the cooler areas of her skin. You'll be surprised how much color you can get away with in skin tones, so I encourage you to experiment and be bold. If the values hold together, so will the colors. It's also better to try more hues than less, as realistic skin is very reflective and translucent. So if you don't use enough color, your skin tones may look robotic and almost mannequin-like. 3 final tips I have for you when drawing portraits are to 1. Squint a lot. This helps you see the drawing as a whole and helps you avoid tunnel vision. 2. Rotate your page. I didn't do this in the demo simply because I was recording, but if I was drawing this for myself, I'd be rotating the page constantly so it's not awkward to apply color. And 3. Look at your drawing in a mirror. This one is super helpful because we all get tired eyes and sometimes it becomes impossible to get a different perspective. Looking at your drawing in a mirror will give you an instantly different perspective, which makes it a lot easier to judge your own artwork. And if you don't have a mirror, just take a photo on your phone and flip it. Join a virtual class to learn live from our professional artists. Get creative assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork. Start today and level up your practice. If you learned something new, like and share this with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here are some other videos you can check out next.